Welcome to another Feature Fridays, and my name is Guy Bartram. I'm Director of Product Marketing in the Cloud Services Business Unit, and today I'm joined by Joerg. Joerg, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hey, I'm Joerg Lew. I'm a Technical Product Manager in the Cloud Services Business Unit at VMware.
And here we're today to discuss your particular area of expertise, right? Cloud Director and the 10.2.2 release, which came out sort of start middle of April. And we're going to dive into some of the kind of cool new features that are there and kind of look at those in more detail. But in general, we're now following a 6-month release schedule for Cloud Director for releases.
So the older versions from 9 to 10, we had this 6-month release schedule, and now we follow a model where we have planned one larger release every 9 months, and then two smaller releases in between. So that 10.2.1 came out in January this year, and then 10.2.2 now in April, and therefore following on that. That also means these minor releases with 10.2.1 and 10.2.2, they already do contain new features, and the goal is that we can deliver and make features that are ready, available earlier, so that you don't have to wait for these 6-month cycles. From an API perspective, we do keep the API backwards compatibility that is very well known in VCD. We are aware that, of course, with VCD you do a lot of automation around that and use the APIs, and therefore we have a very good strategy with backwards compatibility, and we do keep that. With these minor versions, we introduce now for the first time a new sort of a minor version for the API as well. So that's like API version, I think it's 35.2, but that follows the same model. So the new features, as usual, are available through API as well, and through the UI. And then with the next release, we will bump up the API version to 36 as well, but following the same deprecation model as usual.
Interesting. Okay. Well, actually, but 10.2.2 actually has quite a few enhancements of features in it, right? I mean, it's not a slim release by any means.
No, not at all.
Yeah. So this is quite a lot to take in if this is a small release. But I mean, just roughly, right? We've got stuff, new stuff, and we look at the kind of areas we're covering. It's compliance, it's policies and templates, it's networking, it's Autoscaling, which is a great, cool new feature we'll come to in a minute. It's appliance management. And obviously there's some more kind of Tanzu coverage in there as well. So this is all making, the 10.2.2 release quite significant in terms of its capabilities. So,
absolutely.
So let's start with perhaps looking at compliance, and you're looking at specifically FIPS, which is the Federal Information Processing Standard. I guess it's more related to those in North America, but it's nevertheless a big priority if you're dealing with federal. So let's talk about that then. So what is the new FIPS capability that's in 10.2.2?
So that's a setting that you can configure for a VCD cell or a VCD cluster, and each cell in the cluster to enable this FIPS mode. And that means that certain encryption methods are used that are certified by that standard.
Yeah, those are the I'm just looking at the spec here, F140-2 cryptographic modules. Whatever that means, sounds like it's hardcore cryptographics. And this obviously has a little overhead on your applications, on your appliances in any case, because it's doing encryption. But the big thing here is you can just turn it on and off by a simple API call. Is that right?
Yeah, it's even in the UI.
So it's in the UI.
Let me switch over. Yeah, let me switch over to my demo environment here. Share my screen here. So you should see, the release notes, always a good idea, of course, to read through the release notes. We just scroll through them. We have a whole bunch of new features that we look into depth in the session. And we also, of course, have a long list of fixed bugs and resolved issues. So a very, fully blown release at all. Okay, let me switch over to VCD. So I'm logged in as a system administrator to the provider portal. And in the administration setting, you can go to the SSL section, and then that's the setting where you enable FIPS mode. It even does, get the warning that you have some overhead, and also additional requirements that you have to take care of before installing or enabling FIPS mode. Otherwise, your cell might not restart properly. The thing is that this FIPS mode, in addition to just let's say the hard requirements for the encryption methods, also includes a bunch of additional environmental requirements. So I don't think, for example, that it's possible to enable FIPS mode if you upgrade it to a 10.2.2 version of VCD, because the whole standard is about, well, obviously security, and therefore it's better fit for greenfield deployments.
Okay, that's good to know.
And then there are, of course, some other limitations that you should consider. It's not only about the actually activating FIPS for a single cell or a cluster, but you also, of course, have to look at the complete ecosystem in your platform. So I know that vRealize Operations in 8.4, for example, has FIPS compliance with the that you can enable there as well. But if you have other products that integrate with VCD, or even the use, for example, of the cell management tool itself might not be fully FIPS compliant. So that's something if you are in that area and you need FIPS mode, then you know about these requirements typically, just something that you should consider.
Yeah, it's a really good point to note, though. I mean, and having vRealize Operations have support for it is really good, because that's obviously one of the key components to integrate to VCD.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. And another kind of management capability is the enhancement with appliance management, right? So this is SNMP, still good old SNMP for V1, V2, and authentication secure SNMP with V3.
Yeah, so that's something that in past, you either, when you installed VCD on a Linux box, you could use, of course, the Linux capabilities for SNMP, the daemon. And with the VCD appliance in past, it was able to somehow, sort of install additional packages. But now we use the officially supported packages that come with Photon.s with all the VMware appliances, and you can enable them on the appliance with the configurations, which version of SNMP you want, and configure authentication as well.
So that's the VMware SNMP agent, and yeah, if you were using like the old was it Net SNMP module, then you'd have to obviously make changes there and be aware of firewall rules, updates, and things like that. Yeah.
So to enable that, again, let me switch over to the demo, and let me switch over to the right demo. A second.
So just to be clear, then the going back in my SNMP days now, the MIB that is available for Cloud Director is now like fully V3 compliant and can be walked and queried by. Okay, cool.
Yeah. So to enable it on the appliance, there's a command you can see in the documentation with vi cfg -snmp command, where you enable and configure the proper settings that you have. And in the documentation, it also mentions all the different MIPS that are used for VCD. So that's something you can use for whatever system monitoring system you use to read that information. You can use these MIPS to get into the more detailed information. And once you have enabled that, just as a quick overview, for example, you can do on the receiving side, I just used the standard Linux SNMP walk tool. And in my case, I just configured the old version 1 of SNMP, pointed to the VCD appliance, and then run that, and it gives a whole bunch of information that comes out. So not only health information about the appliance itself and the self status, but also some metrics of the I think provider VDCs and organization VDCs that you can have through there. So for example, I think you can get counts from virtual machine counts in the different org VDCs.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So you go and have fun digging around those object identifiers and see what you can find from a mid walk for what you need. Okay. All right. So let's just move on then. So the next thing I wanted to cover with you is something that's been I think it's been in the making for quite a while, actually. A really cool new feature around auto-scaling. You know, making VCD aware of thresholds that when exceeded will spawn out more resources for the VCD, for the VApp. And obviously when those resources aren't required, spin it back down again. Tell us how this works in VCD, because this is completely new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's something it consists of two components. By the way, technically it is an extension to VCD. So we use our own extensibility API for UI extensibility, for defined entities to store the rules, and as a care package for the deployment mechanism. It's just bundled with VCD, so you don't have to download or install any external components, but it does use the same APIs that you could use or other partners can use to integrate with VCD. And after there is some addition to the cell management tool to configure it on the VCD cell server itself, and then you can go into the tenant portal. So here I'm logged in as an organization administrator into my tenant portal, and in the applications menu you can see we have this new setting for the scale groups. You can see, by the way, for the UI extensions, we added some hooks that you can add. Extension can add UI functionality here in the applications menu. And then for the scale groups, you can see your scale groups that you already have defined, or you can define new scale groups. And the idea is that in the autoscaling mechanism takes care of the VM and VApp, VM creation. So it's sort of comparable to the VApp model, but the goal is that the scale group is the entity that manages how many virtual machines you have for that environment. So you select your organization VDC, give it a name quickly, and then you define the minimum and maximum numbers of virtual machines you want to have in there. You select the template from one of the catalogs that you want to use to deploy the virtual machines. And you select the storage policy where it should be placed, where the VMs should be placed. And then for the network settings, depending on the org VDC settings, you either for NSX backed, you have to set up the load balancer rules manually and prepare that. So you prepare a load balancer pool, and then it uses the existing configuration, and load balancer pool has to be prepared to sort of add additional, so that you add additional servers to it. If you have NSXT advanced load balancing, then the autoscaling module can automate that load balancer configuration as well for you. Then you pick the org network and you can create a group. And once the group is created, then you can add these rules for the growing and shrinking, so scale out, scale in, of the of the scale group.
So when you got number of VMs there, is that can't exceed the maximum for the scale group? Is that right?
Yeah, so that's how much for this rule the virtual machines, how many virtual machines should be placed into the scale group.
Got it.
And then you define these thresholds for CPU usage greater to scale in and scale out. And the number of VMs here is the number how many should be added or removed from the existing scale group. Right. You can have a duration so that you don't trigger too many actions based on very short change of utilization. And then once these are added, then the scale group will monitor the environment and deploy and create virtual machines or shrink virtual machines here. And you can monitor the tasks in the monitoring section. I think the whole topic is pretty interesting, and likely we will cover that in another Feature Friday episode in more depth and with more extensive demos.
Yeah, I've got a ton of questions about this because I do remember this was something I think we demoed it at VMworld maybe last year or a year before as an extensibility kind of option.
Yeah.
So it's great to see that kind of flowing into the core product, and also really cool to see that new capability with the menu system here. Is that a 10.2.2 capability where you can now add to these menus? Okay.
That's a 10.2.2 capability, and we also have massively improved over the last time the last couple of months the documentation and the examples for the extensibility. So that's another topic for another session, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a dedicated website, I believe, that's going to be launched pretty soon, just to kind of look at all of those samples as well. Okay, so that's really good to see, and yeah, we'll definitely do a feature Friday on autoscaling. Let's move on then. So the other feature I wanted to dive into is guided tours, which came out in 10.2.1, I believe, and was very much jumped upon straight away by everyone, because it's, obviously the more you can enable your users in context of where they are in the UI, the better. But it had some limitations before, and I believe now some of those limitations have gone. Do you want to give me a heads up on what that is?
Yeah, so the guided tours are also, by the way, a UI plugin technically that integrate with VCD, so you can find them in the More menu. I think we had in one earlier feature Friday when we talked about new UI features in 10.1 or 10.2 last year. We had a discussion about that, how to create these tours. The idea is that you record like the click path that you do for a certain thing. So if you want to teach your users how to create a new virtual machine, for example, you would record the steps in the UI that are needed to create these, and you have some keyboard shortcuts that you use for the creation of the tour. Now, with the 10.2.2 release, these tours that you create can now be published to providers or tenants. So that's something, if you have a larger environment with a lot of, provider operators to support the tenants, you can use the guided tours really to help your own stuff for the operations in the provider portal, or for the tours that are really focused for tenants, you can publish them into the tenant portal. So when you use the menu here, you can have the publish section, and then for the ones that are really they record stuff of the tenant portal, you can publish them to the individual tenants.
So as a tenant, is there any breakdown of tenant role within there for viewing specific guided tours?
That's not yet possible, but you can publish them on a per tenant base as usual.
Okay. Okay.
And you can also include them into the assistant that shows up, that small box when you have the assistant enabled, that shows up in the portal when you log in for the first time. Yeah, another improvement that we have for this guided tours, which is a big thing that we added, which hopefully increases the number of guided tours that we have in here. So you can now import tours not only from a local JSON file, but also from a Git repository. And per default, it points to the official VMware samples Git repository, where we plan to add additional tours in future. And since it's a Git repository, we can release them independently from any VCD releases. But you can also point it to your own GitHub repository if you have your own ones, for just the ones that are relevant for your environment.
That's awesome. So that's a total new feature, that is the ability to import directly from GitHub, right? Okay.
And that's something where we plan to, not only from a VMware perspective, we plan to publish more and more tours, but we also, since it's a Git repository, we can also open it up to other folks who want to publish or even translate tours. So the guided tours always have been supporting the different languages, so you can have the same tour but have the description in different languages, because we know that, since it's the end customer facing portal that we are talking about here, the globalization and translation is a big topic for a lot of non-English speaking environments, and therefore it is possible to have the same tour you recorded once, because the steps obviously are always the same, but then the tour is automatically picked in the right language that's defined in the browser and uses the same language as the portal itself. So you have some consistency here. And all that information is stored in the same JSON file that represent guided tour. So when we establish the Git repository and add some more examples from a VMware perspective, we can have, regular open source pull requests from other people who might add translations to existing tours, or to create and add some new tours, net new tours to the repository as well, and share them with others.
Okay, so how do people go about publishing their tours to the GitHub repository? Is there an export capability here?
Yeah, so that's something for the individual tours. You can save the tour, and then these tours are being saved as a JSON file, and then you would add that JSON file to a Git repository, and then Git takes care of the versioning and increasing. But again, the topic is well big enough, and I think it's worth for another future session here where we show the whole procedure.
Yeah, we're just tickling people's interest here, but this is awesome. I mean, this for me is you know, when I look at the UI changes in just in last year, there's been some significant step forwards in the VCD UI, and I think this is, you know, just VCD really growing up as a fully mature product. This type of stuff is brilliant. It's really to me rounding off the solution nicely.
And it helps, of course, service provider to onboard their own new operational stuff, and of course onboard new tenants as well.
Yeah, we always get that. We always ask, service providers are always asking us for, you know, where can they publish their kind of run and operate instructions to their operations teams, but also then to customers. Okay, so let's have a little look at one other kind of capability, which was enhancements to storage policies. And I believe that these were kind of enhanced so that you could have new catalog specific storage policies. Was that right?
Yeah, not only catalog specifics, but you can now mark storage policies for certain use in VCD. And that is a feature that has been requested very often from our existing VCD customers and partners. And we implemented that, and even more. One use case for that is to create catalog only storage policies that are used for catalogs only, but there are more selections in here. So for that, let's go into the details here a bit, and let me show how you can configure that. So I'm switching over to my vCenter environment, where we do have, let me see if I'm in the right environment here. Yeah, so I have in my vCenter a bunch of data stores that I want to use for different purposes, like for catalog, for named disks, for virtual machines, and so on. So these data stores I can mark in vCenter, for now completely independent from VCD. I can tag them, so you can see here I have created some vCenter tags for data stores, for category data stores, and tag them. And then I can create storage profiles in vCenter to tell vCenter that, well, each data store that has the tag VCD catalog, or for catalog tag in here, should belong to this VCD catalog storage policies. So that is one way in vCenter to group different data stores together that serve the same purpose, or that have the same characteristics in terms of performance, in terms of reliability. You might have some that are mirrored to a different physical storage system. You might have some that run on a faster storage system, so that you get more performance, but maybe at a higher price, for example. Or you might have some that are on an NFS share that somehow gets replicated to for catalog for different environments and so on. So in vCenter, with the out-of-the-box vCenter functionality, you create these storage policies. And VCD does not, well, it deploys, of course, virtual machines and stores stuff in individual data stores, but it does not use data stores as an entity to interact with vCenter, but it uses these storage policies. So when we go back to the provider portal, which is this window here, we can see with the connection to the different vCenter instances here that you have this refresh policies button, which allows VCD to get all the new policies that you have been created. And then in the storage policies section, you can see the different policies in vSphere that are available here. And in your cloud resources section, that's where you can see in the provider VDCs that you've created on top of the individual vCenter server. So here I have one provider VDC that sits on top of that. You can see in the storage policies, these individual storage policies that are defined and configured in vCenter server. And when you have when you select such a storage policy, now in 10.2.2, the new button that we have here is the edit supported types. And that's now where you select which entity types of VCD should be stored in on that storage policy. And per default, if I have a look at one of the old existing one, before I upgraded to 10.2.2, they are, of course, set to all entities. So in past, VCD that not separate between the different types that are stored there. It just uses the storage policies that you've defined, of course, taking care of all the quota management, but it still would store different types in the same data stores.
So you didn't want your sort of your catalog media that really has no processing requirement on your ultra fast.
For example, And now you can do that. You create different storage policies in vCenter. You add them all to the provider VDC, and then in the provider VDC for each storage policy, you can select which of the 6 types should be used for the storage policies should be used for which of these 6 types. So here I have one that is just used for catalog media, so ISO files and VApp and VM templates. So that would be a catalog only storage policy. You can see here we have not only the catalog only storage policy enabled with that, but it also has a separate entity for named disks, which is pretty interesting because these named disks typically might be shared between different virtual machines, or might be, well, not necessarily attached to individual virtual machines, but might be, well, like a persistent data store, a persistent disk used for different virtual machines, where the virtual machines themselves change over time or are rather ephemeral in a DevOps environment. And that, of course, also means that you might have different requirements, storage requirements for these named disks compared to, for example, the disks that belong to the virtual machines that you delete as part of a DevOps pipeline again. And then you would mount, as part of your pipeline, you mount the existing persistent disk to the new VM and get your database data back, but all the rest of the application code where you have a new version is changed on in the template, for example.
Yeah, got it. And you can see, I can see there Kubernetes Tanzu clusters, edge gateways as well. Okay.
So it's very powerful and gives you a lot of flexibility to tell VCD which type of storage should be placed where. And as usual with the storage policies, you name them and then you can add them or publish them to the individual organization VDCs that run on this provider VDC. So here I have one that runs here, and it's again in the storage policy section where you then add the one for the individual organization VDCs.
So the big difference here is that, sorry, just to summarize here, the big difference here is that before you would have storage policy assigned to an org, but you'd have no way of constraining that policy to only use a particular object type. Now you can actually constrain it to use like catalogs and Tanzu, Kubernetes clusters, etc. Okay.
Yeah, and if I now switch back to the tenant portal and I navigate into the organization VDC, if I now, for example, create a new virtual machine, that new VM here, not one from template, select my operating system, then you can see here you have the not only the placement policies, but for the storage policies. Let me see where I have them. It only shows the vSAN policy, but not the VCD catalog policy, because that is not enabled for VM storage.
Got it. Awesome. That's I can imagine that's been quite high in demand. Okay, well, whilst we're on policies, there was also a fairly another high in demand kind of feature that was added, which was global placement policies, which essentially allowed a VM or VApp template to be instantiated on, I've got to get this right, another PVDC, but within the same VCD environment.
Yeah, so that's something. We have these placement policies in vCenter, that you configure for an individual cluster. So you have you can specify host groups or virtual machine groups, and then specify different constraints. So with these, that's again a concept of DRS, Distributed Resource Scheduler, in vCenter. And that allows, first of all, to have, for example, different virtual machines always be placed on different ESXi hosts, or you want to keep them together to get advantage of the high latency and the high network performance in between the virtual machines. Or you can create VM to host rules to sort of force DRS to have different virtual machines only run on different ESXi hosts for different reasons. Might be that you have different performance, different CPUs in sort of performance configuration of your ESXi host, or for licensing of applications, where the application vendor tells you, well, with vMotion, you could, in theory, run that virtual machine in the whole cluster. So please license the whole cluster for your single virtual machine. And therefore, you can sort of limit that to only 3 hosts and then run your database servers. Make sure that they only run on these 3 hosts.
Yeah, and very useful feature,
that. in VCD, VCD did support these settings in past as well. So when in past we had there were a setting for the provider VDC. So if I'm switching back here to the organization, to the provider VDC, there are these VM placement policies that you could create for an individual provider VDC, and then you give it a name, demo name, and then you get selected from that provider VDC. You can select in the cluster the VM groups that have been created. So this is on a provider VDC, and here I have my VM group that has been created. If I switch back here in vCenter, so that's sort of the VM group that I have here, which I want to specify that they should run only on a particular host. And now with 10.2.2, this setting is no longer per provider VDC setting. If you have multiple provider VDCs, that gets a lot of overhead to maintain and manage. But we now have in the global section, when we go to the cloud resources, you have these VM placement policies down here. And these are the global placement policies that you now can define. It follows the same model. So you create a new placement policy. Let me do that.
Is there any reason why it's not called global placement policy at this point? It would probably be a bit easier to distinguish between the two.
Placed on one host in the cluster. In my case, the rule is that it only placed on the 3rd host in the cluster in my small demo environment. And now the big change here is that you not only select the rules defined in one single vCenter and for one cluster, but you can define them for multiple provider VDCs. So I have another provider VDC with a completely different name and a different cluster. And of course, well, it doesn't have to be the same name, but also a virtual machine group that is defined there, where I want to use the same functionality and place them in here. So you can select them here and then create your global placement policy. And then in the organization VDCs, that's where you can publish them to the different organization VDCs.
So in the past, you would have had to replicate these policies into different provider VDCs. Is that correct?
Yeah. So you would have to replicate them. And if you have multiple provider VDCs, it's really, make sure that the settings are consistent in vCenter, and then create individual ones and sort of add them up. And now in my organization VDC, I can add them, this placement policy to the organization VDC. And then it gets automatically published, well, to that organization VDC. And then if I switch back again to the tenant portal as a tenant user in the organization VDC, I want to create a new virtual machine. So same thing as before. 01 here. I want to create a net new one. Then I am doing Windows whatever. Here in the placement policy, you can now see here that it shows up with the placement policy, and that's where you would name of course, name that so that your tenants can understand that, be that different host model with different capabilities, might be perhaps different CPU type that's in there. If you have certain applications that run differently on Intel or AMD, or you might have different capabilities there, or of course based on the licensing. So if it's a licensed only thing that only should run on certain hosts, then you would add that here as well, and then this can be done.
Brilliant. Well, that's going to help with providers that have got estates with multiple provider VDCs. It's going to make their lives a lot easier.
And there's one big attention or a big new feature for that as well, which is pretty helpful. So if you as a provider create via templates from existing virtual machines, and you assign these VM placement policies to the template, and then capture the VApp into the catalog, the configuration for the placement policies is now part of the VApp template itself. So that means within the VApp template, in some metadata environment that you cannot change, or that the tenant user cannot change, it is stored which placement policy should be used for which template. So that means as a provider, you can create your templates for a SQL server, and in the template define, okay, this template, when it gets deployed, automatically has the SQL server placement policy on there, and then VCD takes care of really placing that all the virtual machines that have been deployed from that template automatically onto into the right hosts.
Excellent. That's going to be that's also a very useful feature. That's going to save service providers a lot of time.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, Joerg, I mean, there's a ton of other stuff to kind of look at, but I think that's all we wanted to cover for today. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct for today.
Cool. And we haven't touched the networking enhancement or the Tanzu enhancements as well. So if you're looking at understanding more about what's in VCD, have a look at the as Joerg's showing now, the release notes. These will tell you exactly what's being released, and we've covered some of the major ones here. I think these are fantastic steps forward. There's some really great usability and manageability there as well, which is going to make everyone's lives a bit easier. Joerg, thank you so much for walking us through these updates today, and really appreciate you taking the time to step us through it.
Yeah, thanks very much, and see you next time.
Cheers.